Yagli Adam Dunstan Kelan, Doris Derenge Chida'a Ghislaine, Carlisle Derenge Chada'a Ghislaine, Jackie Hansen, Shukda Inlan, Larry Dunstan, Shtukda Inlan, Charlene Dunstan, Shabu Inlan, Darren Shugo Ashlan Shida, Walamut, Oregon, Shogo Shkaye Kalanda, and Ore Saldanu Shogo Yeshtuda. So that is how I introduce myself, however poorly, in Dena'ina Kanaga, the language of this land. And whether or not you speak Dena'ina, you may have been able to guess some of what I was saying, and it's probably not my job title or where I'm from, or where my college is. So what kinds of things do you think I was saying in that introduction?
Your parents were,
yeah, your parents and your grandparents. And so that would have been a traditional way of introducing yourself, and folks will still do that sometimes as well. And it starts the conversation with relationships, which I think is a good place to start this conversation, because I wanted to say a very profound note of gratitude to Danielle, first off, for inviting me to give this talk. I was really honored to get to be part of this series and to be the first one. Thank you. This exhibit is wonderful and very, very inspiring, and I'm excited to be a small part of it. I also wanted to say thank you to the sovereign nation of the Kenai. I am not Dena'ina myself, if that wasn't obvious. However, I have had the good pleasure over the last several years to be invited by Kenai Indian tribe to be involved with a number of projects, not the least of which is interviewing people about their thoughts, feelings, and histories with salmon. And so I've been able to learn from friends and associates over at Kenai Indian tribe, and so to connect to them very much so. If there are any folks in the audience who are tribal members or tribal employees, I hope I'm doing the topic justice. Now, let's start with this. As I was looking at the exhibit, this wonderful exhibit that's been put on and that's been generously donated to by several Kenai people, among others, I was struck very, very, very heavily by the connections of land and water that are seen in that exhibit over there. And so I wanted to start my remarks by saying that caribou are ocean creatures. Caribou are marine mammals. Now you're looking at me and you're saying this man is an idiot, he's a moron. I want a refund. Oh wait, I didn't pay anything for this. I guess I'll just leave out the back door. But please stay with me. There's a reason I'm saying that they're ocean creatures, and it will make sense in about 20 minutes. But you know, the reason that sounds weird, one of the reasons it sounds weird, is because as human beings, we like to put things in boxes, right? It makes things easier. The famous anthropologist Mary Douglas, the British anthropologist, she said that we like to have things in place, right? We like to have sort of a conceptual schema of the world. This goes in this box, this goes in this box. We don't like things that go in more than one box or don't fit in one of the boxes, and we label those things as polluting. So we like our categories, we like our boxes. It makes things easier. We think of ocean and land as different things. We think of sea creatures as separate from land creatures. Even for me as an anthropologist, when we look at different cultures, we think of them a little bit in terms of boxes, not to trivialize, but for example, if I look at this painting right here, or this etching, this is a home on what they're calling Unalaska, and it's an Unangan home historically, and it's a really, really beautiful piece of artwork. And of course, when we see this, we're thinking of Unangan culture, so what's sometimes called Aleo culture, and so I'm thinking like, okay, like coastal ocean life, right, like amazing seafaring group of people. And then when I go over here to this next piece over here, if you can't read the sign, it's Koyukan. So Koyukan is a Diné or Athabascan group, right? So when I'm seeing that piece of beautiful artwork, that mask, I'm thinking, okay, Koyukan, Athabascan, like the deep forests of Alaska, right? The lands and the forests far into the interior of Alaska. So we kind of have these boxes that we assign things to. And one of the things that I love so much, there are millions of things that I love about learning about Dena'ina culture on this land that we live, but one of the things that I find most fascinating about Dena'ina culture is their unboxiness, by which I mean the degree to which Dena'ina culture doesn't go in those traditional boxes. And here's what I mean by that. If you're at all familiar with any of these other interior Athabascan or Diné groups, the vast majority live far into the interior of Alaska historically, right? And so we think of them as folks of the forest and hills and occasionally mountains, right? But Dena'ina are interesting in a profound way. Oral history, archaeology, and linguistic evidence all point to the interesting fact that folks came from the interior, potentially from Mount Susitna area or Mount Denali area, depending on the different narratives, and then came down and built a life on the coasts of the Kenai Peninsula and on the coasts of places like Iliamna, in the place that we now call Cook Inlet, which is a weird thing to call it, since Captain Cook utterly hated Alaska, never stepped foot on it, and promptly got himself killed a year later. The proper name in Dena'ina is Kahtnu, which is Big Water River, roughly translated, which is a much more beautiful name. But in any case, Dena'ina people moved to Kahtnu, to these coastal areas, among others, and built a life and thrived for centuries, as they continue to do at present. And so I love the way in which that culture defies our boxes, right? Because if I were to, well, go to this exhibit over here, I'm going to get back to those other slides. Those of you who are concerned about missing 3 slides will be back. But anyways, if I was to go over to those exhibits over there, I could pull out any, let's say, 10 artifacts, and I could tell you a story of Dena'ina as coastal people that would sound a whole lot like, again, Wenongan folks out on the Aleutian Islands, right? I could, for example, look at that stone oil land. As the sign suggests, it's not clear if it's Dena'ina or Wenongan, but in any case, Dena'ina people did have stone lamps in which you would place seal oil, among other things, for light and warmth. And so I could point out that, or I could point out in those same exhibits, I could point out these. If you can't tell what those are, among other things, you have barbed projectile points that you would put onto your spear or to your projectile when you're catching marine mammals, occasionally when you're catching fish or when you're catching otters. I could also point out that we have a variety of fish hooks right here. Some of these are antlers, by the way. They're like antlers with a divot put inside of it, and you have like a swivel point that would then jab itself into the animal and get lodged there. And then sometimes you would have a stick that basically follows behind along with like a seal ladder, like an inflatable ladder that then gets it dragged so that it just slows the animal down. So I could point out that technology. I could point out these sort of 3-person kayaks that are going on. That one is actually a ship kayak. You can tell by the regalia that the people inside of it are wearing. But there's stories along with it from Peter Kalfornsky that talk about the Dena'ina version of that same watercraft, and also about the sealskin crafts, and they also had moose hide canoes that you could basically take downstream. And so if I told you all of those things, you'd be saying like, wow, what an interesting group of people that built their whole life around oceans. And that would be true, to a great degree. That would be a true story. Conversely, I could tell you a story about Dena'ina people using a bunch of other artifacts in that same exhibit. I could pull out these amazing birch bark baskets that have been donated, and we could talk by the Wilson family and others, and we could talk about that. And we could talk about these caribou skin boots and a variety of other things. And there's a bear gut skin bag in there, which is beautiful, and a variety of other things. And then there's like this sturdy niche, this sturdy log cabin, and I could share all that with you. And we would say, wow, this group of people that just like thrived with like the forest creatures and the mountain creatures, and that would also be true. And the thing is, both parts of those stories are true. Kahtnu people historically have a territory that we all live on that stretches very much from this coastal area all the way deep, deep, deep into the foresty mountain interior of our Kenai Peninsula, out into the mountains even, where folks were hunting and living. And so these are interconnected parts of their life. And what I want to try to show today is that that coastal side of their life and that like forest/mountain part of their life were not two separate things, but intimately interwoven together. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But before I get there, you can see these kind of land-water connections even in the group of peoples named for themselves. The name around here for Dena'ina people, for the Kenai River area Dena'ina people, was Kahtnu and still is Kahtnu. If you ever spend any time around Kenai headquarters, you'll notice, for example, some murals and paintings and clothing that will say, to let Kahtnu people thrive forever, or to help Kahtnu thrive forever. That term, Kahtnu, is being translated here. By the way, I loved this part of the exhibit where it says, we're still here. That's such a powerful message. And it's being translated, though, Kahtnu Ana as river mouth people. And that is a good translation. That is a correct translation and a very good one. However, the term itself is kind of interesting if you break it down. The Kahtnu Ana, the Ana part means, right here, that basically means peoples. The TNU part is basically saying that it's like a river or a stream. Okay, so this makes sense. The Ka part, we translate it into English as river mouth, but in Danaina, if you're being really literal about it, what it actually says is not river mouth, but river tail. And the reason is because in Danaina thinking, this is the tail of the river, where the river empties out into Cook Inlet, and in a sense, this is the mouth of the river. So somebody help that make sense to me. Why would the mouth of the river be out here? That's the exact opposite of English. Go ahead.
Because that's where the water gathers together to go to the ocean.
Right. Precisely right. That's where the water is gathered, right? That's where the water, in a sense, is consumed by the river, right? Now, if you have some good knowledge of biology, you've probably noticed, as have I, that animals generally don't drink out of their tails, right? They drink out of their mouths. And so, in a sense, Danaina makes a lot more sense than English in that regard. The mouth of the river should be up here, right? And the tail should be down there. So it's funny how a simple little word can teach you a lot of things about how a river works and a way of looking at the world. So in any case, though, I want to talk about these land-water connections in Danaina culture, but as I do so, I'll be using these artifacts to tell a story about Danaina life about 300 years ago. And it'll be interesting, I hope, and we'll learn some things about the past, but I want to emphasize as strongly as I possibly can in no uncertain terms that Danaina are not past tense people. Danaina are not past tense people. Danaina people are the foundation of our community here in Kenai. That's literally what the city of Kenai was built around. Old Town Kenai is the village of Kahtnu Ana people. And literally we can basically throw a stone from this building over to the Danaina Wellness Clinic over there, right? And we literally have Canadian employees sitting in the audience. So we're not talking about past tense people, even though we are talking about what people were up to in the past. We're talking about people's ancestors that are very much here in our community. But in any case, let's talk a little bit about land and water connections. This, you'll see this in the exhibit. This is a birch bark container, and it's got a bunch of stones in it. And the reason that it has that is because of the way in which you traditionally cook with it. Is anybody familiar with how you cook with it? I know you are, Rebecca, but you're not allowed to talk, so Rebecca's a coworker at the college, but anybody else familiar with how, I'm just kidding, obviously you can talk, just not for this specific question. Anybody familiar with this method of cooking? It's pretty fascinating. So, yeah.
You heat the rocks and stuff in the water and
Precisely, right. So you cook up your rocks really hot in the fire, place them into the basket, which is full of water, and once it's started to heat up a little bit and it's lost its heat, you then deposit another rock that's been heated up and over until you have boiling water, and then you put fish in it, and suddenly you have boiled fish or fish soup that you might give to an elder. And so right there, even in that simple thing, we're seeing these land-water connections. You see them also with salmon, these land-ocean connections. You see it also with salmon, right? Salmon are fascinating how they sort of, again, blur those boundaries of land and ocean. Salmon, of course, consume nutrients from the ocean and then bring it back and then die, right, on the land usually, or be consumed by a land animal, and therefore feed our forests. Our forests would look very different if not for salmon. So salmon are a creature that crosses those boundaries, and Danaina society also crosses those boundaries. And so I kind of want to tell this story today with salmon, partly because I'm kind of obsessed with salmon. That's the project I'm on right now, and I'm a bit of a salmon fanatic. So I'm going to tell you a story about salmon, but I really do see salmon as sort of this thread. If we were weaving something, it's sort of this thread that runs through every aspect of Kahtnu Ana, Danaina life, and Danaina life in general. And so I'm going to draw out a few of those connections. The first point I want to make is that salmon are villages. And now, if you didn't think I was an idiot with the comment about caribou as ocean creatures, you definitely think I'm an idiot now, right? You're saying villages are not made out of salmon. What do you mean by that? But if you've ever learned much about Danaina culture, you know exactly what I mean by that. One of the interesting things about Danaina culture, one of the reasons that Danaina communities thrived around Kahtnu or Inlet, was because of a marvelous, amazing piece of technology called which is often translated into English as a cache pit. And these were used for a variety of purposes, but one of the most common was to store fish underground. It was a deep freeze, but it didn't require electricity or fossil fuels, so the most sustainable deep freeze ever. And they're genius in a number of ways. So basically you have birch bark around the sides, you have moss inside of that. The sphagnum moss around here has some antimicrobial properties, so it helps keep things from rotting. You have grass that keeps things dry in between, and then you have salmon laid in there. And this is sort of your deep freeze that allowed people to do something very, very, very amazing. So if you haven't noticed, at some point the salmon stop running every year. We've only got them for a few months. And so you can't really use them all year in theory, right? If you don't have a freezer. And especially that's true of the silver salmon, which we get right in the late fall, right? In theory, that's a very useful resource, except for they're here, the second run of the silvers is here for a minute, and then it's gone, right? So what are you gonna do about that? Well, Elfman and Pope is what you're gonna do about that. Elfman and Pope allowed people to store the late run silvers and then eat them throughout the winter. And more specifically, it was tied in with the system that we call Geshka. Geshka often gets translated into English as wealthy person, although you kind of have to break your brain from the way that we think of wealth in our society. This is not sort of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. I don't know if I'm being recorded. Anyways, this is not sort of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk hoarding their wealth to build a rocket or something. This is a form of wealth that's thought to be distributed almost immediately. It was true that Geshkas would have, for example, often elaborate dentalium sashes that would show status. That is true. However, generally speaking, the biggest form of wealth were things that were immediately redistributed, one of the most obvious examples being salmon. Everybody would work together to put up salmon during the summer into these cache pits, and they would do that together. And in a sense, the Geshka was kind of a linchpin of that whole thing. So the Geshka would become a Geshka in part by sort of appealing to relatives, often related through matrilineal or avunculocal lines. Appeal to relatives, hey, come fish with me, let's fish this area, and over time you build a community together, right? And you'd have a bunch of people you're related to, and other people too that you weren't related to, that were just friends with the Geshka, and you'd all fish together over the summer, because the way that they were fishing required a whole team. We'll get into that in a minute. And then you'd put it up, and then throughout the winter, the Geshka would make sure that every person had a piece of salmon every single day. So Peter Kalfornsky said it was essentially this big. It's like from here to here. A piece of salmon every day. It probably varied, especially by how much salmon you caught and how long the winter was. You had people that helped determine when solstice was and things. But in any case, the Geshka helped make sure that everybody got some salmon, so that if you didn't fish well if you didn't catch a lot that day from hunting and other activities, you always had some salmon to fall back on. Salmon were your security. And that was absolutely critical. So the Geshka made sure that was shared equally. So if anybody ever says that, a society that shares its resources equally won't work, we've got a perfect example of it working very, very successfully over centuries right here in our backyard. And if somebody says, well, that's easy because they were smaller villages, maybe. I don't know if the size is the problem here. I think there may be other factors at play. But in any case, Geshkas, they didn't just do salmon. Geshkas also, for example, took care of orphans, often adopting the orphans themselves. They looked after families where a husband was away for one reason or another and made sure that women had firewood hauled to their home, or where young boys were away, because they would often be the ones doing that. They resolved disputes at a time when you didn't have, state troopers to call if you got into an argument with your neighbor. And they helped make sure that you could trade with other villages and set up these partnerships with other villages. So they were incredibly important, but in a very real sense, that whole system sort of starts with a leader saying, let's fish together and let's share the fish, and let's share the fish throughout the winter. So in a sense, salmon are villages in that way, right? They form the basis for that. And they form the basis for these sort of large villages of 100 to 150 people sometimes. So we can see these all over the place around here. Down at Cape BC is a large village that was historically there, that was abandoned around 1600. That has about 5 house pits and many, many cache pits. Of course, here in Old Town Kenai, this is a village that has now grown into the city of Kenai, but that's why there's a sign over there that says Kahtnu Village, right? And before that, there was Shutuk, which is right down the road, and over in Kenai Municipal Park, there's even more signs of the village. There was village activity all up and down. But those kind of villages were possible in part because of the salmon. So I want to explain that a little bit. Not only did salmon kind of gather people together as sort of a form of collective labor, but it allowed for people to really lay down roots in a very specific kind of way. Now, if you're not overly familiar with Athabascan or Dene cultures of the interior, folks need to and move around quite a bit as they make use of different land. And that's not to say that people don't have their home base, 100% they do. It's just that people keep moving to different parts of their home base in the same way that like you have a house and you move around to different parts of your house, right? It's just in this case the house is much larger, it's a landscape. Dena'ina people did the same thing. However, one of the things they did that was kind of unique is these incredibly permanent buildings and villages. And what I mean by that is homes that were very, very carefully constructed in a way that would take really weeks, if not months, to build. Among other things, driving in poles and tying off every single one of the layers of logs and then thatching it all with ryegrass to make sure that it was waterproof, and then also putting birch bark shingles on top of it, also building these beautiful shelves and then to sleep on, also having side passages and oftentimes sweat on the side of it. There are these really beautiful structures that would take weeks, if not months, to create. You don't build these if you expect to abandon them soon. These were meant to be permanent villages. Although anthropologists refer to these as winter homes, quote unquote, and winter villages, winter needs to be put in air quotes because this is a Kenai winter, right? So this was essentially 6 or 7 months out of the year. And even during the fall, we have good reason from the historical records and the oral storytelling to believe that people would often stay in their home base for part of the fall and then also go hunting for part of the fall. So people were around in these villages for a major part of the year, and then in the summer they would do a lot of fish camp, and in the fall they would do a lot of going out for hunting trips, but you still sort of had your home base village. And so that's a unique thing for Dena'ina people, right? They made this way of life that took sort of this movement-based life and then added on this sort of idea of like a permanent village, and that's possible only because you have this stable food source that you can get to in these cache pits every single winter. And so it's sort of this draw towards having these permanent roots and allowed for these very large populations. So in a very real sense, salmon are villages. By the way, this is looking at the weirs that people used historically to fish. I said it before it was a team effort. You would build these large traps, and then traditionally one person would help catch them with dip nets, another person would help put line in them to keep them, another person would help take them over to the side, and then women and elders would help clean and gut the fish, and so it was a whole operation. It was not a one-person job, typically. All right, next point I want to make is that salmon are hunting. Hopefully at this point I've proven myself enough that you're no longer thinking this man is an idiot, so just allow me now to explain what I mean by salmon are hunting. Salmon connect the ocean and the land in another really interesting way. So we think of hunting in a Dena'ina context often as something people go out into the forest to do, whether it's the forest right by their house, but around here, especially in Kenai, like going out towards Cooper Land, what we now call Cooper Landing, and other areas to make use of, for example, mountain sheep and things that were way over in the Kenai Mountain, or to make use of some of the more upland mountain caribou herds. There were caribou down here too, but there was larger herds up there. So we think of it like that, right? People would often take these trips way out into the forest, way out into the hilly and mountainy areas away from our Kenai flatlands to go hunting. So how in the world are salmon involved with that? Well, salmon are involved with that in a number of ways. One of the ways is that you've got to eat something while you go hunting. And so oftentimes people would take dried salmon strips with them along with seal oil, and that would be sort of your hunter lunch while you went off hunting. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. Another thing is that people would use salmon as bait. So when you catch a fur-bearing animal, it's ideal if you don't have to puncture its fur and skin because it makes a better fur for your clothing if you don't. And so people would use often deadfall traps. I have a deadfall trap replica, never did it to work right, so I didn't even bother bringing it today. If you were at my last presentation, you've seen me struggle with it and fail with it. But anyways, for Dena'ina people, they work very well, but you needed a bait of some sort. And pungent fish eggs make excellent bait for things like lynx. And so fish were bait to catch these other creatures that you would then make clothing from. Fish were also what I'm calling their offerings, and as is so often the case in my line of work, we're struggling to take a complex Dena'ina concept and put it into English, a language where there's not perfect translations. But I'll explain the practice, and then maybe the imperfect translation will make a little more sense. We have records from a few different early people that spent time with Dena'ina folks that when people would go out hunting in places like the Kenai Mountains or out into the hillier parts and more mountainous parts of Cooper Landing, that folks felt like they were entering a really spiritual space, and they were entering a really spiritual space, and there were spiritual entities there that you wanted to make sure that you were showing proper respect to, as you should, right? If I go to your house, and I'm not usually in your house, I'm not just gonna like barge in and start hanging out on the couch, right? Oh, maybe I'll bring a bottle of wine, or maybe a house plant, or something that says, hello, thanks for inviting me to your house, and shows respect and shows honor to the person whose house it is. And so here, people would sometimes bring fish and other forms of meat with them and other objects and put them in fires and say a saying that I'm not going to say here, partly because it's not my saying to say, but basically was the idea of, we are guests here, help us to have a good experience hunting while we're here. And so in a real way, salmon then was a way of showing respect to the spiritual entities of the hills and mountains where you would be traversing while you hunted. Finally, salmon were really important for dogs, as we have a Dena'ina language expert in our audience, and as she could explain better than I, there's a funny little language thing where the word for salmon and the word for dog are about one vowel apart, so if you're learning Dena'ina for the first time, you can accidentally say that you're eating dog quite easily, but because it's liga and hoka. But it's funny, but it's also kind of poignant, because there's this really beautiful connection of salmon and fish. Historically, people, and I say historically, but this is still something that happens in many areas, and that folks nowadays would be like, oh yeah, we do that. But feeding dogs with salmon, right? So dogs are really, really important in Dena'ina culture, as they are in many human cultures, as our sort of original companion species. Particularly in Dena'ina culture, there's a story when the animals divided into pairs that was told by Peter Kalpornsky, among other people, where he talks about each of the animals and each of the plants sort of finding a partner. So this idea of partnership, you see it between the Geshka of different villages, and you see it with the animals, right? But poor dog didn't have a partner at first. Dog was like this loud, sort of boisterous personality that liked to bark at people, right? They literally say in the story he would bark at anything. I kind of think of when you go to a party and there's like that one guy who's talking a little bit too loud for everybody else. You're like, oh, all right, you're cool, but maybe not who I want to stand right by. So anyways, dog is pretty boisterous, but then dog ends up pairing with humans. And it's a good thing he does, because dog is fundamentally necessary for human life in a lot of ways. In a Dena'ina context, dogs, among other things, were used for hunting in at least 3 ways that I'll mention. The first one was that dogs would help catch bears. There's a variety of ways to catch a bear, even as a puny human, if you can find them in their den. It's the finding them in their den part that is difficult. Dogs would help to sniff out where the dens were so that you could find the bears. Of course, this would always be done with respect. Bears are, in many ways, sacred and respected being in Dena'ina culture, but they would occasionally be hunted for practical reasons, among them to use their furs for various things. And so, dogs were necessary for that. Dogs also, according to both Joan Townsend and Cornelius Osgood, who you're like, who are those? They're 2 anthropologists. I don't know why I need to mention their names, just they're anthropologists. But anyway, so according to both of them, dogs would be used occasionally to help hunt caribou. If you're familiar with how wolves hunt, wolves will often split one of the herd animals away from the other herd animals to make them easier to hunt. There is some evidence to suggest that sometimes dogs would do the same thing for people. They would use 3 or 4 dogs to go out there and help separate one of the caribou so they're easier to hunt in areas where you weren't using caribou corrals, which is a story for another day. Dogs were also used for hunting beaver. So you'll see in that exhibit again, you'll see these beautiful caribou skin boots, but then they have a fur on the side, which I think is probably beaver. I'm not 100% on that, but often beaver was used as the top part of your boot. And I don't know if anybody's ever tried to hunt a beaver in a dam. I don't know, you're a bunch of Alaskans. Alaskans do strange things. Have any of you ever tried to hunt a beaver in a dam? Anybody? Nobody? Okay, well, I guess. Oh, okay, I didn't know that. I've never tried to hunt a beaver, right? I'm more of a moose man myself. Okay, well, one of the things, I guess I can say anything then, because none of you beaver hunt. So one of the things about beaver hunting that made it difficult historically for Dena'ina people, and for any other group of people, was that you got your beaver dam, right? You find your beaver, and then as soon as you start trying to get into the beaver dam, what is the beaver going to do? Swim away, right? They've got 1,000 little exits away from their dam. They'll just get away from you. Even if they're on land, they can get a little bit fast, and so they can just kind of scramble out of the hole, get onto the bank, and then get over to the river. So people would use dogs historically to help find the different holes in the beaver dam, right? Dogs have a great sense of smell. They'd figure out the different holes where they could smell the beavers. And then the humans would set up human people around the edges where they knew there were holes so that they could more easily catch the beavers as they tried to leave the den. And then beavers were, of course, very useful for clothing and different things. So this all brings me back to my original point. Please?
Curious about dogs. Where did they come from?
So dogs have been domesticated from wolves many, many times throughout human history. And so around here, they were domesticated from local wolves as well here in North America. Great question. Yeah, so they were local. So all of this brings us back to my original point that you all laughed at me about of caribou being marine mammals. I don't literally mean that caribou are marine mammals, but what I mean by that is there's an extremely short line of connections between the ocean and hunting caribou out in the mountains. You can talk about, you've all heard of like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, is that still a thing people say? Okay, you can kind of think of like 6 degrees of salmon in Dena'ina culture. Everything is connected to salmon in one way or another, and in this case it's a very short stream of connections. Salmon were caught, humans would eat them and then use them as they went out to hunt as, again, ways of showing respect, as hunting food, as different things, as ways to feed their dogs, and then eventually they would come back with caribou. Then among other things, people would use both for meat, but also for beautiful, beautiful clothing, which you have several examples of there in the exhibit. You would have caribou tunics. There was different types for both summer and winter, but caribou tunics, caribou leggings, and caribou boots. So in a sense, we have all this beautiful land-based clothing because of the ocean creature of salmon. And same with bears. In that exhibit, you'll see, among other things, this beautiful bear gut skin bag that's been donated by a member of our community, a former member of our community, and it is only possible, things like that historically would only have been possible in part by partnering humans with dogs, right? Try to go toe-to-toe with a bear, it doesn't end well for you. So humans partnered with dogs, and dogs, of course, were fed very often by salmon, particularly pink salmon, which is an interesting story in and of itself. So salmon then become this kind of connection of ocean and land that's connecting village and leadership and dogs and hunting and warmth and fish and clothing. Oh, and I forgot one other thing. Quickly, before I end, both caribou and bear were used to warm yourself back in those homes that I talked about. You're going to get really cold in there, right? So sometimes people would use bears as part of a door covering. That also helped with if you were doing old smoking, if you're familiar with the concept, really like using, especially on the summer homes, like use the bear's skin out of entrance or other things to manipulate the amount of smoke that's in there from your fire so that you can then do a cold smoke on your salmon. But caribou, meanwhile, were often used as part of sort of a sleeping bag arrangement so that people could stay warm in their homes. So there's all these connections of ocean and land. So we're denying that people historically ocean adapted? Yes. Land adapted? Yes. And it was salmon running as a thread throughout all of that. Tragically, that land and water connection turned tragic in the age of the Promised Land. And that's a hard place to talk about, but it is a place that I do want to talk about because it's relevant to this conversation. During the Russian fur trade period, of course, the attraction of Russians to this area was in large part creatures like otters, right? These creatures who themselves span the boundary of ocean and land. And especially in the first 15 years during the Promised phase, there was devastating amounts of violence and forced labor and different things. There was also sometimes voluntary labor, and I'm not at all trying to downplay voluntary labor and voluntary trading and voluntary relationships that were formed. 100% that was a thing. But there was also sometimes very brutal things that happened. So in that case, ocean and land took an ugly turn. Moving into the late 1800s, we then had the rise of the commercial salmon industry, and as you may or may not be aware, once again we see sort of this close connection of ocean and land for Kahtnu Ta'ana people, as many, many, many Kahtnu Ta'ana Kenai people went to work for canneries and for commercial salmon operations, initially at a wage rate that was approximately a quarter of their white counterparts, but over time, many Kahtnu Ta'ana people became full partners in, and in many cases, owners of various commercial ships and commercial operations, thus maintaining a connection with salmon that goes back literally millennia. So I guess I want to end the remarks there, partly because remarks do have to end somewhere. But I want to end with perhaps a little bit of a soapbox, 5% of a soapbox, which is that I hope that part of what this story reminds us is that boxes, as useful as they are for categorizing things, don't really work at the end of the day when it comes to ocean and land. It turns out that things we do on the land always somehow flow down to the ocean and it also turns out that the ocean has a way of having the waves take things back to shore. So as we make difficult decisions as a state, which of course I don't have an opinion on, as we make difficult decisions as a state about things like energy and mineral use, we have to think very intelligently about the fact that things tend to not stay put. That's not how land and water work. So let us show respect to land, let us show respect to salmon, and let us show respect to the indigenous peoples of this space, to whom, as always, I say Chipenic. So thank you very much for your time and attention.